The guns of World War I had barely fallen silent when Germany was forced to sign its own disgrace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, did more than end a war. It crippled an entire nation. It accused Germany of starting the war, demanded colossal reparations, and stripped it of territory, colonies, and pride. The once proud empire was reduced to a political experiment called the Weimar Republic, an infant democracy birthed in shame, debt, and resentment. For ordinary Germans, the years that followed were a nightmare. The economy spiraled out of control. In 1923, hyperinflation gripped the country, so severe that a loaf of bread could cost millions of marks by afternoon. Imagine watching your life savings become worthless overnight. Middle-class families were reduced to begging, children starved. Elderly citizens wept over pensions that could no longer buy a cup of soup, but the pain wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Veterans returned to find their sacrifices mocked. The government, blamed for surrendering the war, was seen as a puppet of foreign powers. The public was told that they hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed from within. This became known as the stab-in-the-back myth, and it spread like wildfire. Amid the collapse, extremist ideologies flourished. Communists fought in the streets, right-wing militias formed. The fragile democracy cracked under the weight of hate, fear, and disillusionment. People no longer wanted debate, they wanted a savior. And in that chaos, a little-known figure with a big voice began to rise. Adolf Hitler's origin wasn't marked by greatness. Born in a small Austrian town in 1889, he was the son of a domineering father and a doting mother. He dreamed of becoming an artist, but twice rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, Hitler drifted into obscurity. He lived in shelters, sold postcards to survive, and developed a deep loathing for the multicultural city around him. It was in the slums of Vienna that his early anti-Semitic ideas took root. Then came World War I. Hitler eagerly enlisted in the German army. For him, the war was not a tragedy, it was a revelation. He served bravely, was wounded, and decorated. But when Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler was shattered. He didn't believe his country had lost. He believed it had been betrayed by Jews, socialists, and weak politicians. After the war, Hitler returned to Munich and took a mundane job for the military, spying on political groups. One day, he attended a meeting of a tiny organization called the German Workers' Party. Something clicked. He stood up and delivered a spontaneous speech, and left the room buzzing. From that moment, he wasn't just a listener, he was a leader. Hitler joined the party, and soon reshaped it into his own vehicle for power. It was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party. Its message, national rebirth, racial purity, the end of democracy, and revenge. Hitler wasn't charismatic in the traditional sense, but he had something darker: rage, conviction, and timing. At rallies, he could mesmerize thousands. His voice would rise to a scream, his fists clench, his eyes burn. People didn't just hear him, they were possessed by him. He offered what desperate people wanted most: certainty. He told them who to blame. He promised them greatness. And he vowed to punish those who had humiliated them. In the heart of a broken Germany, Hitler found his stage, and the world would never be the same. By 1923, Germany was boiling. Hyperinflation had crushed the economy. Political violence was erupting in the streets. Hunger, fear, and anger consumed the nation. It was the perfect storm for a radical takeover, and Adolf Hitler knew it. Inspired by Mussolini's fascist march on Rome, Hitler decided it was time for his own revolution. On the night of November 8, 1923, Hitler stormed into a beer hall in Mattisseto, Munich, where over 3,000 people, including key Bavarian leaders, were gathered. Dressed in a trench coat and flanked by armed Nazi stormtroopers, he fired a shot into the ceiling and declared, "The national revolution has begun." It was bold, it was theatrical, and it was a disaster. The attempted coup, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, was crushed the next day. Hitler's men were scattered. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler himself was arrested and charged with treason. But in prison, something remarkable happened. Instead of fading into obscurity, Hitler became a national figure. His trial turned into a stage. He delivered passionate speeches, blaming the Jews, the Communists, and the Weimar Republic for Germany's collapse. The courtroom applauded. Newspapers printed his words. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison but served only 9 months. And during that time he wrote the book that would become his manifesto of hate, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In it, he laid out his vision, a racially pure Germany, the destruction of the Jews, the expansion of German territory, Lebensraum, a one-man dictatorship over a reborn Reich, but most importantly, Hitler had learned a vital lesson. He couldn't seize power by force. He would have to do it legally. From within the system. The failure of the putsch didn't end Hitler's rise, it refined it. The 1920s brought brief stability to Germany, but it was an illusion, built on foreign loans and fragile politics. And then, in 1929, the world collapsed, again. The Great Depression, triggered by the U.S. stock market crash, devastated the global economy, but nowhere was the pain sharper than in Germany. Overnight, factories shut down, banks failed, and millions were unemployed. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans had no job. Desperation filled the streets. In this chaos, extremes replaced reason. People no longer believed in democracy. They wanted change, any change. And Hitler was ready. The Nazi Party, once a joke to many, suddenly became a force. Its rallies filled stadiums. Its posters promised hope and strength. Hitler no longer wore a military uniform. He wore a suit, looked like a statesman, and spoke like a savior. His message was simple: I will rebuild Germany. I will punish the traitors. I will make us great again. He blamed the Jews, the Communists, the Treaty of Versailles, and the so-called November criminals. And it worked. Millions believed him. Millions voted for him. By July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler still wasn't chancellor. Germany's political system was a mess, fragmented, leaderless, and paralyzed. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging World War I hero, was reluctant to appoint Hitler. He called him a Bohemian corporal, not worthy of high office. But behind closed doors, conservative elites made a fatal calculation. They believed they could control Hitler. They thought that once in power, he would be tamed by the responsibilities of government. So on January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg gave in. Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. He didn't seize power with guns. He was handed it with a handshake. Once Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, he didn't waste time. He knew that power wasn't just about laws or armies. It was about control over minds. And to control minds, he needed propaganda. Enter Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. A master manipulator of words, images, and emotions, Goebbels believed that propaganda wasn't just about persuasion. It was about saturation. Every poster, every radio broadcast, every children's book, every movie, all would tell the same story. Germany was strong. Hitler was the savior. Jews were the enemy. The Nazis used radio like a modern-day internet. They made cheap radios available to every household so the voice of Hitler could reach every German living room. His speeches, fiery, theatrical, hypnotic, became national events. The carefully staged rallies in Nuremberg, with tens of thousands, marching in perfect lines, glowing torchlight, swastika banners, and Wagnerian music, created an illusion of unstoppable power, and it worked. Millions were mesmerized, not just by the message, but by the emotion, the fear, the pride, the unity. In a broken world, Hitler offered certainty. The Nazis also understood how to reach the youth. They created the Hitler Youth and League of German Girls, where children were taught to obey, to worship the Führer, and to spy on their own families. School books were rewritten, science became racial biology, history became myth, Reality became whatever the regime said it was. Meanwhile, the Nazi regime staged elaborate parades and spectacles to showcase order and strength. Behind the scenes, opposition newspapers were shut down, dissidents were jailed, and a sense of fear wrapped in pride spread across the country. The swastika wasn't just a symbol, it became a spell cast over an entire nation. Despite his party's popularity in 1932, Hitler still lacked absolute power. The Nazis didn't win a majority, and many in Germany's ruling class still viewed him with suspicion. President Paul von Hindenburg, Germany's elderly head of state, considered Hitler dangerous and uncivilized, a vulgar demagogue. For a while, he refused to appoint him chancellor. But Germany's government was collapsing. No party could build a working coalition. Riots, assassinations, and political paralysis made the streets feel like a war zone. The country was at a breaking point. Behind closed doors, conservative elites, bankers, generals, and aristocrats met in secret to decide Germany's future. And they made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought they could use Hitler. They saw him as a tool, someone who could rally the masses, crush the communists, and bring order. They believed that once he was chancellor, they could control him. So on January 30th, 1933, the moment arrived. Hindenburg, under pressure and out of options, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. There were no fireworks, no bloodshed, no civil war. Just a quiet ceremony. Photos show Hitler smiling stiffly, shaking hands, standing beside men who believed they were smarter than him. They thought they'd hired a puppet. Instead, they'd unleashed a predator. Within weeks, Hitler would reshape the entire government, crush his opponents, and take the first steps toward becoming a dictator. He didn't overthrow democracy overnight. He suffocated it, one law, one lie, and one silence at a time. Adolf Hitler became chancellor on January 30th, 1933. But chancellor was not enough. He didn't want to share power. He wanted to eliminate it. And then, just 4 weeks later, something happened that would change everything. On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, went up in flames. Fire raged through the iconic structure, reducing its majestic chambers to rubble and smoke. The Nazis immediately blamed communists. They arrested a young Dutchman named Marinus van der Lubbe, a communist sympathizer. Whether he acted alone, or whether the Nazis orchestrated the fire themselves as a pretext, remains debated to this day. But for Hitler, the truth didn't matter. The opportunity did. The very next day, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, a sweeping emergency law that suspended nearly all civil liberties. Freedom of speech, gone. Freedom of the press, gone. Right to assemble, gone. Privacy in one's home, gone. This decree allowed mass arrests without trial. Thousands of communists, socialists, journalists, and political rivals were rounded up and thrown into prisons, or worse, Germany's first concentration camps. With his opposition crippled and the public gripped by fear of a Red Revolution, Hitler pushed forward with his ultimate move, the Enabling Act. On March 23, 1933, under intense intimidation and Nazi presence in the chamber, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval, even if they violated the Constitution. With one vote, Germany ceased to be a democracy. No more checks, no more balances. Adolf Hitler now ruled by decree, and the people, many terrified, others convinced he'd save them, cheered. Democracy didn't collapse in a single day. It was burned, bullied, and buried, and no one stopped it. With the Enabling Act in hand, Hitler wasted no time. He began transforming Germany into a totalitarian nightmare. The Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party. All other parties were banned, their leaders imprisoned or executed. Trade unions were dismantled, replaced by Nazi labor organizations. The courts, the police, the civil service, all purged and brought under Nazi control. Even the church was infiltrated. Pastors were pressured to conform. Those who resisted, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were arrested or killed. But control wasn't just political. It was personal. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, had the power to arrest anyone without explanation. They operated in the shadows, creating a state of paranoia. People began to fear their neighbors. Children were encouraged to report their parents. Speaking against the regime, even in private, could mean disappearance. The Nazis also institutionalized their racism. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of German citizenship and banned marriage or relations between Jews and Aryans. Jews were barred from universities, professions, public life. They were dehumanized step by step, law by law. Meanwhile, Hitler crafted his image as the infallible Führer. His photo was in every school, every home. His voice echoed through every radio. Every aspect of life, from textbooks to theater, was designed to glorify the regime and erase dissent. Opposition wasn't just punished, it was eradicated. By 1934, when President Hindenburg died, Hitler merged the office of Chancellor and President. He became Führer of the German Reich, the supreme leader of a now fully Nazi-controlled state. The transformation was complete. Germany, once a struggling democracy, was now a nation under absolute rule. And the world had no idea how dark things were about to get. We often look at history and tell ourselves, it could never happen again. We imagine that Hitler was an anomaly, some monstrous exception, a product of a different time, a different world, but history whispers a darker truth. Hitler didn't rise alone. He rose on the shoulders of a broken society, a society that was angry, afraid, and desperate for answers. He used legal systems to gain power. He used propaganda to shape reality. He used division to destroy unity. And he used silence, the silence of those who knew better but did nothing. And when we look around the world today, we see shadows of those same conditions, economic crises pushing people to the edge. Populist leaders blaming minorities and immigrants for society's problems, attacks on the media, on truth itself, political polarization so deep it feels unbridgeable, and growing numbers of people who feel disillusioned with democracy, ready to trade freedom for the promise of strength. It may not wear the same uniform, it may not speak the same language, but the danger remains because the human emotions that empowered Hitler still exist. Fear, anger, hate, hopelessness, blind loyalty, and perhaps the most dangerous of all, forgetfulness. The rise of fascism wasn't just about jackboots and speeches. It was about ordinary people looking away, convincing themselves it wasn't that bad, that it would pass, that someone else would stop it. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. So, could it happen again? The answer is yes, if we let it, if we forget what happened, if we stop defending truth, if we fail to recognize manipulation when it comes wrapped in flags and slogans. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and the tune is playing once again. History has given us a map, a warning. We cannot undo the past, but we can learn from it. It's up to us, all of us, to protect democracy, to speak out against hate, to resist the pull of fear and division. Because if we ever ask, how did this happen? Again, let it never be said that we weren't warned. What if the most devastating chapter in modern history didn't begin with war, but with a whisper? Not with bombs dropping, but with cheering crowds. Not with evil revealing itself, but with hope, twisted, desperate, and blind. This is not just the story of Adolf Hitler. This is the story of how a democracy, an advanced, civilized, educated society, collapsed into dictatorship. And the most terrifying part? It happened legally. It happened gradually. It happened with the people's consent. We imagine monsters as obvious villains, but Hitler didn't come wrapped in flames. He came with promises. He offered national pride, economic revival, order, glory. And when a broken nation listened, they applauded. Germany after World War I was a nation on its knees, crushed by the Treaty of Versailles, shamed on the world stage, devastated by inflation, unemployment, and starvation. And in that wreckage, a dangerous question began to rise. Who's to blame? Into that question stepped a man with answers, clear, simple, false. A man who understood that fear is stronger than facts, that anger is easier than understanding, and that lies, repeated often enough, become truth in the eyes of the desperate. Adolf Hitler didn't just manipulate politics, he manipulated pain. He turned the trauma of millions into a weapon. He convinced a wounded people that their suffering wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated, that enemies lived among them, that he alone could fix it all, and the world let it happen. Governments underestimated him. Citizens rationalized him. Opponents ignored him. By the time the alarm bells rang, he wasn't knocking on the gates of power. He was already inside. This is not just a history lesson. This is a warning. Because in today's world, we see echoes, economic turmoil, divided societies. Leaders rising, on the backs of fear, nationalism, and rage. And once again, many ask, could it happen again? To that, history answers, it doesn't repeat. But it rhymes. So before we walk blindly into another storm, we must look back, clearly, honestly, completely, at how a struggling artist became the dictator of one of the most powerful nations on earth, at how a democracy was dismantled without a single foreign invader, at how millions were led into darkness by following a man who promised the light. This is how Hitler rose to power, and this is why we must never look away.